Well, good evening, everyone, and a very, very warm welcome to everyone who's joined us for this webinar here and divestment campaign launch to get the Open University to divest from the arms trade and Israel. We'd like to extend a particular welcome to our speakers and a big thank you, and also to those of you who are joining us for the first time. We've got no less than 159 people registered tonight, so a big welcome to you. And we really appreciate your openness and willingness to learn about this issue. Now, if you'd asked me a year ago if Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions, or BDS, was a good way forward, I would have been on the fence. I could see that BDS had been an effective way to bring the South African apartheid regime to an end, but I'm normally one that advocates dialogue and negotiation over sanctions and alienation. What has happened in the wake of Hamas's 7th of October 2023 attacks, however, has been a wake-up call for me, and I'm sure for many others too. I've educated myself, I've read everything I could possibly get my hands on, I've used my research skills, drawn on my moral compass, and also experienced firsthand how those who speak out against the ongoing atrocities are being silenced through various tactics by those who have a vested interest in maintaining their power and privileges. I've come to understand that BDS is the only way to force Israel to abide by international law, which it has consistently violated for decades while enjoying near complete impunity from the West. BDS is the only non-violent method that addresses the root causes of the Israel-Palestine issue and the only one that can attain sustainable peace and justice for everyone in the region. This webinar is not going to focus on the broader issues, but for anyone who's still on the fence or who sees this like the media wants us to see it as a conflict between two equal sides, all I can say is please educate yourselves like I did. Once you have, you will find that things are no longer complicated. Everything will fall into place and it will be very, very simple. What we are witnessing is a textbook example of how ethno-supremacy, colonialism, oppression, apartheid, ethnic cleansing and genocide are logically and inevitably interconnected and an intrinsic part of the foundation of the State of Israel. An Israel that's become increasingly emboldened and outrageous through decades-long impunity granted by the US, the UK, and most of the West. It has resulted in the most unimaginable horrors any of us has ever seen and a complete moral collapse of the West, including, unfortunately, universities. You may remember that just a couple of years ago, following the Black Lives Matter movement, everybody agreed that settler colonialism and ethno-supremacy was a bad thing, one that we all agreed that we had to fight against by decolonizing higher education. Well, if you thought that then please ask yourself now, what is stopping you from taking action on Israel-Palestine at this moment? Okay, so here are some of the sources that I've engaged with over the past year that I really recommend you start off with if you don't know much about this issue like I did earlier on. But in terms of the divestment campaign then, this was initiated by OU staff, the OU branch and the trade union UKU and student groups in July 2024. And somebody will paste the link to the petition in the chat as well, I think, or in the Q&A. In the course of just 3 months, we've collected over 1,600 signatures, which is much more and in a shorter span of time than the fossil fuel divestment campaign a couple of years ago. And this is in spite of the fact that we've only been able to circulate the petition to relatively few people across the university. So please do share the petition widely and sign it if you haven't already signed it. As of yet, the OU administration has not sent the UKU branch any comments on our petition or its info. So I'm sure others in the webinar here will talk about the effectiveness of BDS, but here are some of the universities that have recently divested from arms companies or Israeli firms or voted to do so. So it's Trinity College Dublin, King's College is the first college in London, University of York, Trinity College, Cambridge, and University of Edinburgh. And these institutions are important trailblazers that show ethical leadership. And this is an opportunity for the OU as well to be part of this growing group of institutions. But this is not only a moral imperative, it is also now a legal imperative. The BDS movement will no doubt be galvanized by the recent ruling of the International Court of Justice in July that member states are under obligation not to render aid or assistance in maintaining the situation created by Israel's illegal presence in the occupied Palestinian territory, as well as the historic resolution by the UN General Assembly last month, which overwhelmingly voted for imposing sanctions on Israel for the first time, let's not forget, in 42 years. Also, the Open University has its own responsible investment framework, which outlines an approach to investment that aims to incorporate environmental, social, and governance factors into every investment and lists conflict as one such factor. So what is going on is the genocide of our time, one that will stain our history for generations to come. We are all by default complicit in this genocide unless we speak out and take action against it. So the question we put to our university is, what side of history are you on? Okay, so a warm welcome then to our 6 speakers. We're very lucky that we have no less than 6 speakers with us today. We're going to start off with Stella Swain from the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, then Les Levidov from the OU Palestine Solidarity Group, followed by Dina Kadumi from London School of Economics Divest Campaign. Then we'll have a 15 to 20 minute Q&A session, the first one out of 2. And then we'll go on to David Johnson, Professor Emeritus at the Open University, and then over to Anusha Patel from the student group OU Friends of Palestine, and then Ben Wiedel-Kaufmann will sum it up, or will finish off with, and he's from the OU UCU branch, and then a final Q&A at the end. So to ask a question, please go to the right-hand side of the MS Teams chat and choose a question from the drop-down list. We will favor a question that focuses on divestment. If we do get a lot of questions, we will need to be selective, so apologies in advance if your question is not addressed. You can also like other people's questions too if you'd like them answered. In terms of our code of conduct, we'd like to ask everyone to use respectful language. We will not accept any form of discrimination or harassment, whether based on race, gender, sex, sexual orientation, beliefs, age, disability, religion, or lack thereof, or socioeconomic background. And we encourage anyone who has experienced or witnessed any form of discrimination or harassment during this webinar to alert us. So without any further ado now, I'll hand over to Stella Swain. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christina, and thank you everyone for having me here. Yeah, I'm Stella. I work with young people and students at the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. So I mobilise students in their universities and organise with young people outside universities around BDS campaigning. So a quick explanation of who PSC are. The Palestine Solidarity Campaign is a democratic organisation. We've been campaigning since the 1970s in solidarity with the Palestinian people's struggle for liberation. We see solidarity as material, as a necessity, as rooted in the calls from our Palestinian siblings, and as something that is essential to every person of conscience. We organise to build worker, student, and people power, a mass movement in Britain for Palestinian freedom, justice, and equality. Because we know that the blockade of Gaza didn't start in October, nor did settler attacks on Palestinians across the West Bank, the destruction of homes, the infinite detention of children, or the system of apartheid, which is embedded in the very formation of the Israeli state. But now, more than ever, as we hear horrified about the atrocities experienced by the Palestinian people on a daily basis, we must redouble our efforts in this country to echo their bravery in the face of massacre. And our universities are complicit in this genocide. British universities invest almost £430 million in companies complicit in Israel's occupation, colonial system of apartheid, and ongoing genocidal attacks. But what does that mean? Basically, universities across Britain invest, usually through secondary investment funds or trackers, but sometimes directly, in companies which supply the Israeli military with weapons and technology, supply or actively prop up Israel's expanding settlements based on stolen Palestinian land, and provide or maintain the infrastructure for Israel's illegal military occupation. And this is significant because Israel can only maintain its system of apartheid, constant bombardment of Gaza, military occupation, and enable settler violence because of the equipment and services that it receives from a range of companies and the impunity it receives from states like Britain that trade with it. So, one of the material ways we can support the Palestinian struggle in universities is by hitting these companies which allow Israel to maintain and reproduce its violent occupation. By demanding that our universities divest from all companies which are complicit in Israel's system of apartheid and genocide, we can force them to move their money away from these complicit companies, cutting these companies' profits and damaging their PR strategies by associating them with genocide. Ultimately, the aim is to force companies to reconsider whether they want to be engaged with Israel, leading to the economic isolation of the Zionist state and cutting their supply of products used to maintain the occupation. In the meantime, it also means our universities, and therefore our money, is not being used to support a genocidal state. And we're not doing this out of nowhere. We push for boycotts, divestment, and sanctions on Israel in answer to a call put out by the BDS movement in Palestine. This was launched in July 2005 as a grassroots movement founded by a coalition of 170 Palestinian civil society organizations, including trade unions, student groups, women's groups, and other organizations, which formed the BDS National Committee, which is shortened to the BNC. The BNC called on people internationally to do more than just raise their voices in concern for Palestinians or offer charity to Palestinians. They called for material solidarity, calling for organised responses across the world to hold their institutions, companies, and governments to account for their role in enabling Israel to continue its occupation. We can do that in the UK by using the tactics of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, targeting the Israeli state and complicit companies and institutions. This international approach, using the tactics of BDS, was inspired by the movement that brought down apartheid in South Africa, as you just mentioned previously, so we know it can and must win. This is why many of the student encampments across the world that we've seen in the last few months have had divestment from complicit companies as a core demand, and why many student organising groups have been campaigning for divestment for years now. It also allows us to build coalitions, in many cases working with students opposing, say, Barclays for climate campaigners. Other racial justice campaigners might be opposing the arms trade, and you can work with them to ensure that your campaign is reaching the broadest possible movement. This tactical choice of how to present your campaign will differ depending on different universities and the specific cultural context there. But the crucial thing is to engage and build as broad a mass movement as possible and keep pressure up on the university wherever you can. And we've had some real successes, again, as was mentioned just now. In June, students received a commitment from Swansea University Administration that they would divest the £5 million they held in Barclays Bank, which is a campaign against Barclays which drew on research by PSC, War and Want, and Campaign Against Arms Trade that found that Barclays invests over £2 billion in shares and provides over £6 billion in loans and underwriting to 9 companies whose weapons, components, and military technology are being used by Israel in its attacks on Palestinians. Swansea University's decision came after 28 days of encampment and was a much needed, energising moment for students taking action across the country. But student campaigners had also had success in other universities, even in really old institutions, which you would think would be slow to accept change. So Trinity College, Cambridge, announced that it was divesting its £1 million portfolio from weapons manufacturers in early July. Trinity had held £61,735 in Elbit Systems, which are the makers of the deadly Hermes 450 and 900 drones, amongst other weaponry. Students were pointing to the hypocrisy of a university which claims to contribute to society through education, whilst investing in weapons used to murder Palestinians on a daily basis. Now, full divestment, not only from weapons manufacturers, but from all companies that contribute to or profit from Israel's occupation is still the ultimate demand. But even where university administrators have been reluctant to commit to a divestment, the encampments and student organising in general have won concessions which prove that universities can and must take action to support Palestinians. So Goldsmiths became the first in the country to offer undergraduate scholarships to Palestinians. Cardiff University has doubled the number of scholarships for asylum seekers. And in June, the University of Aberdeen committed to joining the Higher Education Scholarships for Palestinians scheme. Many student organising groups have also pursued the tactic of pushing for new ethical investment policies within their universities, which would prevent future investment in complicit companies and necessitate an investigation into current links. Cardiff, Aberdeen and Goldsmiths all also agreed to implement a new ethical investment policy that would preclude funding companies which are linked to apartheid. Each of these victories shows, contrary to the attempts in the mainstream press to dismiss student protesters and campaigns, that pressure can force universities to make real change, and it's our duty as students to ensure that we hold our universities to account. Thank you so much for having me here today.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that, Stella. Okay, as I said, you can ask questions in the Q&A, and we'll pick them up, possibly some of them in the break after the first three speakers. But I'll now pass over to our next speaker, who's Les Levidoff from the Open University Palestine Solidarity Group. Over to you, Les. I've got some slides for you here that I'll just share.
Yeah, just go ahead.
Yeah.
And while we're waiting, I'd like to mention on behalf of the group that we will favor questions that relate most closely to the theme of this particular webinar, which is about complicit investments and complicit institutions, such as universities, which hold those investments, complicit with Israel's illegal occupation and, more recently, genocide. So please send questions, especially about the topic of this webinar, which is one of many, many webinars being held on the overall issue, especially since the last year. So title here is...
Sorry, is this showing up okay, or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so title, OU's Complicit Investments, Big Tech Roles in Israel's Settler Colonial Apartheid Regime. So next slide.
Yeah, I know.
Okay. Our campaign demands that the OU divest from funds complicit with Israel and the arms trade, categories which have significant overlaps. For many years, the OU has had such investments. Last year, the OU divested from large funds, including hard carbon companies, which were also complicit in Israel. Substantial funds were shifted to the Troy Trojan Ethical Fund. So let's look at what ethical means in this case. It has investments in a large number of companies. We compare that list to the well-known list of companies complicit with Israel and identified 7 in that category, and we listed them at the end of our divestment open letter, which also includes a brief note on each of those 7 companies to explain their complicity. But in particular, I'm going to focus on Microsoft and Google, which is owned by Alphabet. And together with Amazon, they comprise big tech, as they are called. So next slide. And here you can see the close relationship between Microsoft and Israel. This is a hoarding Tel Aviv. In Hebrew says, the heart says thanks to the forces of security and rescue. We could ask, well, who's security and who's insecurity? Next slide. Now the CEO is shaking hands with the Israeli Prime Minister, and we'll see what that means as I continue. Now, Big tech companies don't sell military weapons, so they would not come under the category of arms companies targeted by many boycott campaigns. But their electronic systems provide crucial means for Israel to maintain and extend its settler colonial apartheid regime, including means to render military weapons more effective. For several years, big tech complicity has provoked many staff members to raise the alarm and organize protests. So here was the first phase where Microsoft employees launched a campaign, No Azure for Apartheid. I'll explain Azure a little later. Next slide. So these protests came together in a sector-wide campaign, No Tech for Apartheid. This illustrates why an anti-militarist divestment campaign needs to encompass more than just arms companies. Yeah, next. Okay, next slide. Now, as the context for the role of is, we need to look at the settler colonial apartheid regime. This has had several aims: to make everyday life more difficult for Palestinians, to preempt any collective resistance against being colonized, to fragment their national unity, and to undermine their culture. And this applies throughout all of historic Palestine, across the different categories of Palestinians, including those who are citizens of 1948 Israel. According to a report by Amnesty International a few years ago, the apartheid regime has 4 pillars. 1, fragmenting Palestinians into separate domains of control, dispossessing them of land and property, segregating them from each other and from Israelis, and removing their economic and social rights. Those pillars have increasingly relied on novel technology. So move on to the next slide. The technology helps the regime to monitor, intimidate, and attack Palestinians. It also sanitizes remote attacks, that is, electronically remote attacks, as morally more acceptable to the perpetrators. I'll go through 3 examples from those big tech companies. First, Microsoft's Azure has been used to power Israel's digital surveillance tools to monitor and limit Palestinian movement throughout historic Palestine, including 1948 Israel and the West Bank. The tools help repress dissent and protect expanding illegal Jewish settlements, whose establishment dispossesses Palestinians of their lands and resources. Further to Azure, now note the predatory metaphor of the next system. Wolfpack is a set of software tools that enables the Israeli military to collect and access biometric data on Palestinians. These databases contain photos of Palestinians, as well as their name, address, family members, and quote, any information that might otherwise be collected by the civil administration, which is a euphemism for military rule. There are no rules, except the arbitrary decisions of the Israeli Defense Force. Moreover, since 2022, Microsoft's Azure has powered Elbit Systems technology. Its drones have been used for systematically surveilling and sometimes assassinating Palestinians. Azure powers OneSim, Elbit's military simulation software, which is used in training centers to mimic real-life battle scenarios for tank crews. Now, the second example on the screen, Google's Nimbus cloud services. These are a crucial infrastructure for the Israeli military. The Ministry of Defense has its own so-called landing zone into the Nimbus infrastructure. State-owned Israeli arms companies are required to use Google and Amazon cloud services through Project Nimbus. The contract with the Ministry of Defense includes AI capabilities such as face detection, object tracking, sentiment analysis, as it's called, and other complex tasks. Now, the third one there takes further the AI. The Nimbus cloud services are central to Google's Lavender AI system, which Israel has used for mass targeting of Gaza's population. Google designed AI algorithms for this purpose. It claimed to identify 37,000 Hamas targets, very broadly defined, which include low-ranking militants, junior staff, community leaders, journalists who are supposedly part of Hamas, and so on. To kill them, the military gave the Israeli Defense Forces permission to kill increasingly large numbers of others, any others who might happen to be nearby or in the same building. And this is done through so-called dumb bombs, which have enormous explosive power, quickly destroying a multi-story building, whose results you've probably seen in the news reports. They have become standard weaponry, yet somehow are supposedly used in a manner that ensures, quote, a high level of precision, according to Israeli military interviewees in a Guardian report. The Lavender AI algorithm has helped to justify mass murder and assuage any guilt about it. As one intelligence officer said in these interviews, quote, the machine did it coldly. That made it easier. And the targets keep coming, end quote. Hence the death toll exceeding 40,000 or more and rising for the foreseeable future. Now, next slide. Now, just some images of the protests. People arranging themselves is the Google logo with the bombers. Next. And the excavation of the cloud site for Project Nimbus. And the next one, the protests specifically against that project. Okay, next one. Now, since this is an academic setting, I'll bring in some concepts, in particular modernizing Israel's military and its coloniality. The Israeli regime has sought those innovations explicitly to modernize its military, as they say. Indeed, big tech helps to modernize Israeli settler colonial domination. This may sound like an historical anomaly, because social sciences generally understand modernity as societal progress beyond colonialism. Yet this stereotypical sequence inverts the historical reality. Colonial projects have often reinvented modernity as means to claim epistemic superiority and thus moral superiority over the colonized people, alongside actions devaluing or destroying their cultures, including their knowledges. So colonial modernity, as a concept, helps to understand the big tech Israel partnership. Through AI algorithms, they jointly strengthen the military-industrial security complex. Here, security means total subordination of the colonized people, throughout historic Palestine, or if necessary, if they refuse subordination, their genocide and or expulsion. Colonial projects have long served as laboratories for state-business partnerships to maintain control over subaltern people and their resources. Not coincidentally, the Palestine Laboratory became the title of an important book documenting such partnerships with Israel. So next slide. Yeah, here's the book by Anthony Lowenstein with the subtitle, How Israel Exports the Technology of Occupation Throughout the World, and that includes resource plunder. Now, why especially Israel? Now, this is the next slide. Since the late 19th century, the Zionist project has been modeled after the European white supremacist settler colonial regimes. They variously robbed, starved, dispossessed, and massacred the indigenous people, especially in North America, South Africa, and Australia. The Zionist project created a perversely Jewish variant of that racist project with the aim to establish an ethno-supremacist, so-called Jewish regime in all of historic Palestine. Israel has pursued this aim through the past century or more, and more recently through more diverse means than before, including high-tech remote systems that help to distance the violent perpetrators from their victims, thus exemplifying colonial modernity. Next slide. And that feature of big tech is relevant to many other institutions, whose investments may include big tech. So the OU is complicit in this settler colonial regime, especially its military, through investments in big tech within the so-called ethical fund. How can this be ethical? We say, decolonize your investments, remove all those complicit with Israel. And the final slide is next. Delete. That's all. Thanks for listening.
All right, great. Okay, perfect. So thanks so much for having me, and to the organizers. And I think the last two presentations really set up what I'll be discussing. So I work at LSE, and today I'm just going to give an overview of what we've been doing at LSE, and particularly talk about a report that we used to sort of kick off our divestment campaign. I'm not going to go through everything that we did, but the point of this is just to say that there were many steps along the way, petitions by different interest groups within the university. There is the launch of this report, Assets in Apartheid, which I'll discuss in more detail. There was an encampment. There was pressure on specific points when the council of our university, which is the decision-making body, was going to discuss divestment. And all of this has led to the university saying that they will consider divestment, but first they must change their ESG policy. And that process has now just opened this month, and it involves different stakeholders contributing to it. We're still sort of seeing how that's going to unfold. So I'm going to spend most of my time discussing this report that we launched in May that was published by the LSE Palestine Society and written by staff and students. And the report looked at the complicity in the genocide of the Palestinian people, the arms trade, and climate breakdown. So LSE has, for the last several years, published its investment portfolio. So we had access to these documents. And the important thing to note here is that LSE only invests really in bonds and mutual funds. So there are no direct stocks. And they tended to kind of hide behind this idea that they don't directly invest in particular kinds of companies. But once we sort of had this document, you then need to kind of unpack what each of these bonds actually means. And behind each mutual fund, just like the last speaker was talking about, is a whole host of companies within it. And so we had to go and find the mutual fund reports for all of these mutual funds and see what companies are actually underneath them. This led us to really begin to map out how, a company within a mutual fund that's then, invested in by LSE through an asset manager, how that's all linked together and what documents govern that process, and where we needed to invest our energies, both in understanding that process and also pressuring different people within LSE to sort of see how these decisions that get made go down this chain and then invest in companies particularly within mutual funds, but also in bonds. So part of this was also looking at the existing ESG policy and seeing how it was kind of lacking and why this led to, in some cases, for example, even though it was said explicitly not to invest in tobacco, there was a mutual fund that had a tobacco company in it. So, what is actually driving this? And we kind of, saw four main parts coming out of this policy. And one is that it distinguished between direct and indirect investments. So although it doesn't define what that is, generally a direct investment would be in a stock and an indirect would be in a bond or a mutual fund. And that has to do with how you, as the investor in the company, your role on the shareholders meeting. okay? Like what pressure you can put on that company to change its practices. The other thing is it tended to use this kind of flexible language, like as far as possible, we will not invest in. So that always gives you a sense of leniency on that. LSE does have a strong commitment to net zero, and that was cited in the current ESG policy quite a bit, and in other LSE policies and other parts of the university. But there's this very uneven attention to fossil fuels versus the arms industry, and human rights concerns are almost not present. They're only really related to, how companies, and this going back to what does ESG actually mean and what ethical investments actually are, they tend to just relate to how companies, what their employment records are. Do they, in their supply chain, have slave labor, for example, but not actually what they actually, produce and who their clients are. And then lastly, the people sort of governing all the decisions around divestment were really people that come from the financial sector. And there weren't, people who were familiar, or like their expertise was in the climate crisis or in human rights violations, for example, or the arms industry. So we decided that we would establish new exclusionary criteria for the ESG policy. So the first we called it was crimes against the Palestinian people. And we defined that as supporting illegal Israeli settlements, supporting the Israeli military or police. So that would also include supporting them with any kind of equipment or technology, as discussed in the last presentation, and or anything that sustains apartheid. We then focused on, we made a conscious decision to build on all this work on divestment that has come from the climate movement and from, people like the Campaign Against Arms Trade. So we decided to bring that into the report from the beginning as well. So a complete divestment from any companies involved in the extraction and distribution of fossil fuels, proliferation and manufacture of arms. And then this last one, we decided that we also needed to target these financial institutions that were involved in financing these things. And this is going to be quite a big sticking point, I think, moving forward, and I'll discuss it at the end. So how do we figure out who's involved in these 4 exclusionary activities? So we went through and found sources and databases that are regularly updated. So we wanted to show how the university could technically and feasibly actually find out who was involved in these companies, rather than just saying, a blanket like you need to divest, right? So part of this was sort of the exercise of a proof of concept of how you would actually go about doing it. And these are all listed in the methodology of the report. So what that meant is that we ended up producing a 116-page report, which our management likes to constantly talk about, that it was 116 pages and very, very long to read. But we, put every company that was involved in these egregious activities. We said what activity they were involved in. We cited where that information came from. And then we said exactly, which holding the LSE had that company was in, what was the total amount the LSE has on that holding, and then within that, how much is in that company. So for example, this is our entry for Boeing. So LSE has, close to 98,000 pounds in Boeing, but when you see that it's actually related to this one mutual fund, and LSE has 17 million pounds in one of them, and then 14.5 in another, you see the implications then of kind of what they would have to do to divest just from Boeing, is get out of that mutual fund completely. So our key findings is, the portfolio itself was 485 million, and we identified 89 million that was involved in companies involved in these egregious activities. And we further broke that down into how many of the holdings and how many companies there were. And then we produced kind of graphics like this for each of the activities to kind of show quickly what kinds of companies we're talking about. And you can see in this one that there are financial institutions, and a lot of these come from what Stella discussed, which these are the institutions that are funding companies that are on the UN report that further settlement construction and expansion. Okay, so there's a mix of there's arms companies in here, there's companies that profit from the settlements. There's companies that finance from the companies that profit from the settlement, etc. And then this is the second exclusionary criteria: extraction and or distribution of fossil fuels, proliferation and or manufacture of arms, and then the financiers. So this is really a lot of the chunk, and it's something that we want to explore further as we move forward, because I think what an institution can say is, well, we don't actually fund, let's say, arms, but they're funding all of the financial institutions that also then fund arms. And so I think this conversation, given that so many financial institutions are involved in this kind of activity, and then for an organization like LSE, a substantial amount of their portfolio is invested in financial institutions. So where are we right now, and what have we asked? So we've asked to change the ESG policy, and that's in progress at the moment. We want to encourage the school to institutionalize human rights considerations in a number of school policies. So not just the ESG policy, but also the ethics code and the external donations acceptance policy, in which there are some human rights considerations in there, but they're not consistent across all the policies. Enhanced transparency in investments. LSE has hinted that they would continue using private equity funds, but many of these are not transparent. So we are arguing that that's not an option to be an ethical investment. And we're pushing that the actual governance structures are more open to people who are not just from the financial sector and have a very normative way of understanding how to manage endowments. And then, of course, finally, we've asked for complete divestment of all of these complicit entities. So I'm just going to end with two quick slides saying what worked and then what we think the challenges are. So first, just a mix of actions. So we had petitions, direct action, there's the research itself. We had different memos and letters coming from staff to management, rebutting some of the points that management had made. This came from a diversity of LSE members, academic and administrative staff, students, alumni, all different student associations, Jewish staff, and of course our union. We had the external organization support, so people like PSE, War on Law, and Amnesty, CAT, they helped us with our report, and in some cases actually endorsed it. And then actually doing the research and publishing the report became an advocacy and educational tool, and we'll continue using it this year as new students and new staff join our campaign. And it was really incredible to see that once the report was published, a lot of people came to the campaign afterward. So this is what I see as the issues moving forward. We know that UK higher education is under threat with austerity and the financialization of the sector. And so speaking about divestment in this climate is going to become incredibly difficult. There is an openness to discuss divestment of arms and fossil fuels, but Palestine and Israel is still a topic that universities don't seem to want to touch. And so they'll only discuss things in very general terms, but not take a stand on this issue. And this is something we have to think about very carefully. The supply chains and the financing today are more complex maybe than what was happening during the South African anti-apartheid movement. We have subsidiaries and joint ventures and bundled funds and private equity and all these very complicated financial instruments. And it is a real question of how do you even ethically divest in this environment? What's the role of divesting from financial institutions? Increasingly, they'll be used as a way to say that they are investing ethically. And that links to the last point, which is this topic really touches at the heart of the global financial system. And that's why it's also very explosive. So Palestine is revealing these other, injustices in the system itself. And that's why this is going to be such a contested topic moving forward. So thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that. And that was really great to learn from what is going on at LSE. Thank you, Dina. to the next session and introduce our next speaker, who is David Johnson, Professor Emeritus at the Open University. David, are you ready? I know you have some.
Hi, Christina. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Yeah, I've just got sort of 4 points to say. You've asked me to say something about the South African sanctions campaign and reflect on how that might inform the BDS movement. Now, I've got 4 slides. I'll try and share my screen now. Okay, the first point really to make is simply that the timeline of the South African sanctions campaign, it took 32 years from its start in 1958 through to its successful, the liberation of Mandela in 1958 to 1990. That's 32 years. This BDS campaign we're talking about started in 2005. We would hope it would achieve liberation for Palestine a lot more quickly, but it's important to recognize that it's a long and incredibly difficult struggle. It was a long and difficult struggle to bring about the end of apartheid. And just some of the key dates, you can scroll back if you want to check these in the recording. The ANC first calling for boycott of South Africa in 1958. The British Anti-Apartheid Movement in 1959, Trevor Huddleston. Luthuli in 1960 when he won the Nobel Prize, calling for a boycott of South Africa. Crucial also the Organization of African Unity, the UN playing a key role from the 70s, well, from the 60s onwards. And then in the 70s and 80s, it reaches its apogee as more and more countries, more and more institutions throw themselves behind that campaign. So that's the first point, is that it took a long time. The second point is also just to emphasize the range and scale of the anti-apartheid sanctions campaign. It was a global movement and it was supported by pretty much the whole world. In his sort of first speech after his liberation in 1989-90, Mandela identified these different elements and just to run through them, that all African nations played a massive role in isolating the apartheid regime, both through the OAU and its Liberation Committee, but also individual African nations, notably Ghana, Tanzania, Zambia, Angola, Algeria, and Egypt, but also many other African countries. Secondly, the Soviet bloc played an immensely important role, both in terms of material and logistical support, military training, diplomatic aid, with the USSR, the GDR, Cuba, and China prominent. Also, the global south, former colonies like India, Vietnam, Brazil, Indonesia, the Philippines, but also many, many more playing, investing in people dedicating their lives to ending apartheid. The fourth category are the solidarity organizations in Britain, Europe, and North America. The governments of those countries were a long way behind, with Britain and European and the US only really making gestures from the mid to late 1980s. It's worth just reminding folk about the scale of the anti-apartheid movement in Britain. 3 main strategies: lobbying the government and MPs, mobilizing through mass demonstrations, boycotting all economic, political, cultural, sporting links with South Africa were also incredibly important. And just to give you some examples of the scale, in March 1986, in 1 month, the anti-apartheid movement in Britain distributed 750,000 pamphlets, organized 1,000 pickets, and that they did have an effect. That between 83 and 86, food imports dropped by 8.5%, textile imports from South Africa by 35%, and 55 British companies disposed of their South African subsidiaries. And then also absolutely central to the isolation of the apartheid regime was the role played by the United Nations, and you have a list of the key dates there. Resolution after resolution, both by the General Assembly and the Security Council. Okay, so that's the second thing. The time it took and also the scale and the range of the movement was so important. Now, how important was the sanctions campaign to the fall of apartheid? Historians love arguing about historical agency. They love arguing about what caused historical changes over a period of time. And again, I think it's useful to think about how sanctions, boycott, divestment was one of many things that brought about the end of apartheid. It was not the only thing. And there's a kind of broad consensus that it was a combination of factors that brought the end of apartheid. But here I just want to identify those. Internal to South Africa and the frontline states, the key role of working class activism and trade union struggle through, led by the Congress of the South African trade unions. I just looking at one statistic as I was trawling over the history of the 80s. In 1987 alone, there were 1,148 strikes. So a very important role played by an organized working class. Secondly, the mass campaign of civil unrest, the campaign to make the country ungovernable, civic organizations, schools, universities, municipal organizations, led by the United Democratic Front. Third thing that was really important was the military defeats in Angola, where the Cubans and the MPLA defeated the South African army at the Battle of Puerto Carnavale, 87-88. That psychologically, again, had a massive effect on damaging the confidence and morale of the regime. And finally, there were factions within the ruling elite. There was a conservative faction represented by Botha, P.W. Botha, and a relatively, I mean, we stress the word relatively, enlightened verligte faction led by de Klerk that seized power in the late 80s, and that change in the played a role in acquiescing. Now, external to South Africa, what was important was the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was really the end of the Cold War. South Africa was backed by the US because it was seen as a bulwark against communism. Once communism was so dramatically diminished as a threat with the fall of the Soviet Union, South Africa was no longer seen as a strategic partner, as an essential bulwark. The second is the international sanctions campaign, and that's what we're so interested in here, of course. And the economic, political, cultural isolation, sporting isolation that reached its apogee in the 1980s, absolutely crucial. And then finally, it's also important to recognize that the institutions of global capitalism led by the US, the UK, Japan, and Germany, as well as the IMF and the World Bank, they did decide at a key point in the mid to late 80s that their interests would be better served by switching their support from white Afrikaner nationalists to the African National Congress. So there were all of these different elements that contributed to bringing about the end of apartheid. Now, what are the differences between South Africa and Palestine? I think the differences, it's important to register them. There was a strong trade union movement, the labor power of the Southern African working class. The military defeats that you had in Angola were very important. We haven't had the equivalent of those in Israel, Palestine, obviously. Also, that was important to bring about the end of apartheid was the decrease in US, UK, and European government support for apartheid regimes in the mid to late 1980s. There was a eminent persons group from the Commonwealth. There was the European Economic Common Market, Common Community, and the US, all in 86 was a key year, imposed limited sanctions against South Africa. There were, it's actually interesting looking at the data now. Again, there were certain countries that increased their investments in South Africa, notably Japan and Switzerland. I didn't know this until I was checking up again recently. But it was a mixed. It was never a comprehensive sanctions, but nonetheless, it was enough to put grave pressure on the regime. And finally, there was an absolutely total isolation of the regime, the apartheid regime, whereas Israel is certainly not suffering that now. Not only is the US continuing to back Israel, as we know, but also, within Africa, countries like Kenya have remained staunchly pro-Israel, and India under Modi has, when 6,000 Palestinian workers had to be returned, driven out. India sent 6,000 workers as a replacement. India's, Modi's been very sympathetic to Netanyahu. Very, very different to the relationship they had to the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. Now, I want to end off with what the similarities are. That there's vast popular support globally for the Palestinian movement, if not expressed through governments. Certainly, if you think about the scale of the support in the global South, everywhere outside of Northern Europe and the United States, the support is immense for the Palestinian cause. the condemnation of apartheid in South Africa and Israel is emphatic through international agencies like the United Nations. Likewise, the apartheid in Israel and South Africa is contrary to international humanitarian law by the ICJ and the ICC. So there's I think an immense groundswell of global opposition to Israel now that is seismic and is certainly since October last year. I want to end off on a sort of a slightly hopeful note. I've just put the heading there, the hour before the dawn. I wanted to just share some references with you here to say that two points to end with. I think, you know, in the absence of Palestine, there isn't a powerful trade union movement. There isn't the same scale of global support. There aren't imminent military defeats for the Israeli army. I think that the absence of those things makes the BDS movement even more strategically important now than it was in the case of the fight against apartheid. It makes it, in a way, it's the resource, it's the strategy, it's the kind of tactic that is available that needs, you know, really needs to have everybody's weight thrown behind it, because there isn't ways of fighting this particular struggle through other routes, through the routes that were available to people fighting against apartheid in South Africa. And the second thing was just to point to this, just bring it back to the Open University and what's happening now, that there were, you know, there've been Open University individual academics. Joseph Hanlon worked in development studies. He wrote one of the most important reports about sanctions. I've highlighted it there in yellow. And Hilary and Stephen Rose, of course, who were Open University lecturers, one of the starters of the British Committee for Universities in Palestine. And the last point, the book I've highlighted there by Mark Orkin was the best book about sanctions, published in 1989. And I reread that this week. And what was really striking about it and really interesting and sort of gave me hope was that it ends off with, you know, it's got essays by about 25 South African academics who are experts on apartheid, and I would say 90% of them writing in 1989, the year before the end of apartheid. All of them are anticipating apartheid to end 10 years hence. What I derived from that lesson is that when historical change happens, it happens unexpectedly and incredibly quickly. When things feel darkest in the Palestinian struggle, as they do now, things can still change incredibly quickly. In the late 1980s, nobody and very, very few people anticipated the end of apartheid within a year. And this 1989 collection proves this emphatically. People were expecting the horror to continue for far, far longer. And my hope, that gave me hope anyway, that when we think about ending the appalling events that are happening in Gaza now, it's important to remember those kinds of historical precedents, because there are, if you look to history, cases where happier outcomes come a lot sooner than your gloomiest thoughts anticipate. So I'll end on that note.
Thank you so much for that, David. That's a good and optimistic note to finish on. Okay, and I'll now introduce our next speaker, who's Anusha Patel from the student group, the OU Friends of Palestine. Anusha, over to you.
Thanks, Christina. I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about our group, how we've kind of grown our membership, and then cover why we joined the divestment campaign and some of the work that we've been doing in relation. So our club was formed, I think, around 6 months ago now, and we are a club mostly made up of students, like current students, and we also have some alumni in our group as well. As an online student club, we have different challenges when compared to Palestine groups at traditional in-person universities, especially when it comes to visibility and recruiting club members. The primary avenue we use to promote our club is Facebook, where there is a large open university community of students, staff and alumni. From that, we've gained around, I think it was around 200 members within the first 3 to 4 months. And as it got closer to the new academic year, we wanted to focus on recruiting people who would be interested in getting a little bit more involved in some of the activities we were taking part in. So as part of these efforts, at the beginning of October, we took part in the university's Welcome Week. The first event was a clubs and societies fair that some of our members attended on campus in Milton Keynes. As part of this, we had our own stall, and it was a really good opportunity for some of our members to talk to some of the new students about the club, get them to sign the divestment campaign, and also talk to some of the other clubs and societies at the university, because we're really interested in building up solidarity networks between student groups within the university. After the event ended, several members also took part in a protest on campus, where they talked about some of the complicit investments that the university was holding and how this contributed to the genocide in Palestine. We received some really positive feedback from other students about the protest, so we're hoping that at the very least it did raise some awareness about our campaign. Also, as part of Welcome Week, we were able to host our own Friends of Palestine event. It was an online event that appeared on the Open University Student Association calendar, which kind of opened us up to the entire student body. Any current student was able to sign up for the event. We talked about why, as students, it was really important to us that the university divested, and talked about scholasticide and the impact of the destruction of schools and universities in Gaza. I think from these events over Welcome Week, we gained quite a few new members, I think around 30 members over the past 4 weeks. And we've definitely noticed the difference. Our group chat is a lot more active. Many of our members are now sharing resources and information, and it's become a really nice central hub full of ideas. This has allowed us to create a new media team who are responsible for creating leaflets and videos and other promotional material about the work that we're doing. Because we're online, our online and social media presence is especially important. And we're also looking to add more groups to our club structure as we progress. Some of the next steps that we're looking at involve increasing our collaboration with student groups outside of the university. We also want to look at hosting our own online events and joining the student bloc for national marches too. We are also aware that in a few weeks, Cisco, a technology company, is going to be involved in an online careers event at the Open University. Cisco has built several hubs in occupied Palestine. They are complicit in the Israeli surveillance program, and they have close ties with the IDF. We only just received the information yesterday, so we are looking at what we can do to show the university that we don't want Cisco to be involved in any student events. I can move on to talking about the divestment campaign now, and why as students we believe that the university should divest from Israel and arms companies, and why we want arms companies to be removed off campus. So I think first and foremost, as students studying at an educational institution, I think members of our club believe that we have a responsibility to fellow students in Palestine, many of whom have now been killed by Israel. And we have to do what we can to prevent our university from being complicit in crimes committed against them and the rest of the people of Palestine. We've watched this live stream genocide, we've seen this scholasticide, and we are very angry and very uncomfortable that the university is complicit in these crimes. As students, we obviously give the university a lot of money. I mean, without us, there wouldn't be an open university. We don't want the university's money to be invested in firms that are complicit in the oppression and occupation of Palestine and its people. And we think it's really important to make our own voices heard. We also think it's completely unacceptable for the university to use student events like careers fairs to promote arms companies such as BAE Systems, who were hosted at the Open University last year and who provide the Israeli military with weapons. We also don't want these companies to feel comfortable on our campus, as they hold no place on educational institutions. They are completely complicit in the scholasticide in Palestine. And as an academic institution, the Open University should not be welcoming them on campus. The university claims that it's committed to decolonizing education, but in fact, like many other institutions, it's really quick to recognize the oppression that governments like Russia can inflict on countries like Ukraine, but they refuse to condemn Israel, and they refuse to acknowledge their own complicity in the Palestinian genocide. They claim to be truly committed to social justice, and they market themselves as one of the more progressive educational institutions in the UK. But if they continue to fund companies like Alphabet, we don't understand how this can be true. If the university can divest from fossil fuels, which they did at the end of last year, they can also divest from Israel and arms companies, and they can remove arms companies off our campus. So this is why our group joined the divestment campaign. I can cover some of the work that we've been doing as part of the campaign. So to promote the campaign, once we launched the open letter, we've been emailing several notable and honorary alumni who we think might be supportive of the campaign, asking them to show the open letter on their social media and encourage their followers to sign. So far, we've had the campaign shared by Benjamin Zephaniah's family legacy group, and this increased the signatures on the campaign. We've also reached out to Palestine student groups at other universities. So we've promoted their campaigns on our own social media. And in return, they promoted our campaign on their social media. I think actions like this particularly make us feel connected to the bigger student movement. I think often because we are online students, it's kind of hard to feel like you're a part of something bigger. So this connection with other university groups has been really nice for us. We've also reached out to other groups within the university, such as the Pride Group and the Climate Society, because we're really hoping to collaborate with them and hope that they can encourage their own members to sign our campaign too. In order to encourage more of the inactive members of our club to sign the campaign, we also reached out to 150 of them individually in the hopes that they'd sign it, as well as promoting the campaign on our own social media. So far, we found the campaign really beneficial for us. I think a lot of us are really new to organising, especially in the Palestine space. And being a part of the campaign has not only allowed us to kind of learn a lot from the staff groups, but I think it's given us a really strong community of staff, alumni and students who all kind of share the same vision of a free Palestine. And that's really allowed us to grow our own confidence as a group. We've also been particularly inspired by Palestine societies at other universities who have built up really large visibility online and in person, and we really hope that we can achieve the same in future. I would like to end by saying that I think it's really important to remember that we're not alone with this. I know that as online students, it can sometimes feel like we're not necessarily a part of a real student community, but students all over the UK are doing the same thing at their own universities. They're calling for divestment, and just because we're online, it doesn't mean we can't make tangible change either. Students have always been a really key part of global solidarity movements, and in 2024 that revolves around Palestine. We can and we will make a difference with this divestment campaign. Yeah, that's all I have. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Anusha, for that. And now on to our final speaker, who is Ben Wiedel-Kaufmann from the Open University UKU branch. Over to you, Ben.
Hi there, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Sorry, my internet's been playing up for a while now, but I'm glad to be here. And yeah, it's been an excellent and important meeting, and I'm conscious that I may not have a huge amount to add to the insight and analysis we've already heard from speakers today. That said, I'd just like to start by saying how pleased I am to be following Anusha's excellent presentation on the Friends of Palestine group and to be here representing our UCU branch. I'm also very pleased that our UCU branch has played such a leading role in this campaign. As my talk will, I hope, make clear, I think this places the branch within some of the most important and powerful traditions of the labour movement. I also think that such trade union involvement is necessary for the success of this campaign, as well as the wider divestment movement. So how did the branch get involved? Across the first 6 months of this unfolding genocide and deepening edukicide, we passed a series of motions which moved us from calls for a ceasefire and donations to medical aid for Palestinians to the initiation of this divestment campaign. That is towards a determination derived from the call out from Boycott University to, quote, take concrete action to stop the genocidal war on the Palestinian people and to end Israeli settler colonialism. This developing action on the part of the branch and the overwhelming support that each motion gained reflected a much wider process of political education by which trade unionists, both at the Open University and in higher education and indeed far beyond, have moved from a humanitarian and moral reflex towards a concrete examination of our complicity within this genocide and the power that we have to act. As Christina highlighted at the outset, this has been manifest in our own self-education, but also in our collective actions. And it has emerged as a direct response to the calls from the Palestinian Federation of Trade Unions for the support of BDS and the interruption of the supply of arms, as well as, in our sector, Boycott University's call for action. This response on the part of a broader rank and file trade union movement has the potential to be a crucial development in shifting the balance of forces. And I believe it's our responsibility to ensure that it is. Here at the OU, having set up a divestment working group, in April, the UCU branch passed a motion calling for divestment from complicity with Israel and the arms industry, as well as Anusha's highlighted, as the removal of arms companies from careers events. This prompted the UCU working group to reach out to the Palestine Solidarity Group that had formed again in the wake of October and particularly the OU's statement about it, as well as the OU Friends of Palestine group, building a coalition which spans staff, students, alumni, and wider supporters. It also prompted a discussion with the administration to determine the accuracy of our information about previous holdings and undertaking a new analysis based on their disclosures, and that's what I was alluding to earlier. The OU's disclosures eventually revealed that they had indeed disposed of previous funds held in a Bailey Gifford account, moving a substantial amount of about £91 million of their capital into a new, putatively, and I quote, ethical investment fund run by Troy Trojan as part, we presume, of a broader divestment that occurred from fossil fuels in December 2023. But our analysis revealed that the new quote-unquote ethical fund, whilst limiting exposure to arms, pornography, and a range of other industries, itself includes investments in 7 companies with clear and demonstrable links to Israel's occupation, apartheid, oppression, and genocide of the Palestinian people. These are all detailed in the petition and have been referenced again here today. The investment in these companies constitutes a substantial proportion of the fund, some 17.8% or equivalent to about £16 million. And this highlights the entanglement of the capitalist economy, and this question has been raised in the chat, with the Israeli state's illegal actions. As trade unionists, this entanglement should not surprise us, but it should offer us a retort to those who claim, as some have always claimed, that trade unionism has no role to play in political or international issues. In opposition to that sectional economistic view of trade unionism, we're here today because the trade union movement's power lies precisely in its adherence to a class strategy, and that class strategy relies upon collective internationalist solidarity or it's worth nothing. For as these divestments and indeed the broader genocide reveal, the adversary of the labour movement, the capitalist class, does not stop at national boundaries, and nor are its ethical problems confined to a single industry. But we must now demand that they stop at something. And the developing genocide, the systematic destruction of the education system, the systematic destruction of the capacity to reproduce life, and the building on decades of illegal settlement, occupation, and a century-old settler colonial project must now end. And it's this that we're demanding, that this genocide mark a firm line, an end to Israel's central place in this country's imperial interests. But this demand won't be won by moral argument alone, because, regrettably, the genocide being perpetrated by Israel now is, for all its abject horror and immorality, not an aberration. It's a horrific condensation of the violence of our capitalist world system and the processes of imperialism that hold it in place, and a condensation which we must fight with all our power. As a socialist, I'm convinced that the only power capable of making this shift is our collective power as an international working class. So it's not, as this campaign makes clear, happening just over there. It's happening in our name, with British-made weapons, the stamp and legacy of British-American imperialism, with support of academic labour, and with the complicities of companies held in the OU's quote-unquote ethical investment portfolio. And it's this latter support that we're here today to change, to say unequivocally, as a trade union representing OU workers, that investments in companies complicit in the crimes that Ismail is committing are not ethical, they're not compatible with the OU's mission, and they're not held in our name. So it's in the spirit of internationalism, which suffuses the best traditions of the trade union movement, that we stand here today to demand divestment. Ours is a rich tradition, from the Rolls-Royce workers who in the 1970s refused to fix engines destined to support Pinochet's coup in Chile, through to the divestment campaigns which weakened South Africa's apartheid regime, as we've heard, right up to those dock workers in Greece last week who blockaded a port to stop the export of weapons to Israel. Like them, we're here to say, not in our name. Now, this webinar is a modest contribution in those terms, and the risks we are asking supporters to take is much smaller. But a victory in this campaign, shifting the investment policy of the UK's largest university to reject complicity with the arms trade in Israel and remove arms companies from our affairs, would be a very significant victory in a much wider campaign. And it's that we're here to commit to fighting for. Solidarity and free Palestine.
we would like to thank our speakers a lot for coming here and sharing their experience and expertise with us. We really appreciate that. And thank you also for all of our participants and those who have come here and joined us in this webinar. Yeah, that's really all we want to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was very inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you.